Welcome to a new episode of All the Jazz. I'm your host, Matthias, and I have with me a very special guest, Daniel Flynn. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So you are a columnist and an author, and you wrote some Intellectual Morons, which is the book I'm more familiar about. But you also wrote about Jim Jones and Harvey Milk in Cold City, and you wrote about the why the left hates America. And a conservative history of the American left. So there's a lot of political stuff which I'm very interested in. So maybe let's start there. Why do you think the left hates America? That's a simple question.
Well, I wrote that book in the aftermath of 9/11. And what I tried to do is to differentiate the left between sort of garden variety Democrats and liberals. And I think that was an important point to make back in 2002 when I wrote that. It's getting harder and harder to do that. I think for people that disagree with the premise that the left hates America, I mean, they only need to look back what happened in this country last summer, where you have people like U.S. Grant or Abraham Lincoln or Christopher Columbus, men who really were important figures in making America what America is. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, having their statues dragged down, in some cases having them dragged down by the authorities, by the local authorities. That's something that is, as someone who loves this country, it's really hard to see that. It was really, felt like we weren't living in America anymore. And in a lot of these same places, I mean, you brought up the book that I wrote called City. What's amazing is if you go in San Francisco, you're going to find a bridge, the Bay Bridge, at least half, San Francisco, half of it named in honor of Willie Brown, who was a guy who compared Jim Jones to Martin Luther King. And wrote Castro, Jim Jones being the cult leader who, forced 900 of his followers to kill themselves en masse. Real powerful figure in San Francisco. You have part of the airport named in honor of Harvey Milk, a guy who was a booster of Jim Jones, who wrote President Carter saying, when accusations came out that Jones had kidnapped a small child, he wrote Carter to persuade or dissuade him from sending the State Department after Jones, from sending our people after him and to retrieve that kid. Wow. He said that Jones was thought of in minority communities as the man of the highest character, that the kid's real mother was a bald-faced liar, and the father was a blackmailer, and all sorts of things like that. His name's on the airport, at least Terminal 1 on the airport in San Francisco. City Hall, which is the most prestigious address that you could have in San Francisco, it's 1 Carlton B. Goodlett Way. Carlton B. Goodlett was such an ally of Jim Jones that even after he killed all those people, he was still defending Jones and attacking the congressman that went down there to save people, attacking the concerned relatives who criticized Jones, attacking the newspapers who wrote exposés about Jones. His name is on the street that gives the address to City Hall in San Francisco. So I think this is, you have people that have their priorities really screwed up, that they're honoring people who aided and abetted, perhaps the greatest mass murderer in the history of the United States, someone that was a powerful person in the city of San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay to honor them, but to honor Ulysses S. Grant or Francis Scott Key, those are statues that got taken down in San Francisco. George Washington, he's having his name come off a school in San Francisco as a result of this sort of cultural transformation. So all of this, I think these are people that really care a lot about ideology. Yeah. And as far as patriotism, that kind of thing, they're not into that whatsoever. And as evidence of that, just look at all these statues that they're tearing down.
What about people were tearing down statues or renaming schools after Abraham Lincoln? Like, how is that possible? Arguably the greatest Republican in the history of America, and they're saying what? Like, what has he done?
It's very confusing, like their reasons for that. And sometimes when you try to make sense of people who don't make sense, you start to look like the guy who doesn't make sense. So I'm not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole, trying to regurgitate what it is they have against Lincoln or what it is they have against Washington. But it's just to say that, here here's a guy, Jim Jones, who killed more African Americans than any member of the Ku Klux Klan in the history of the Ku Klux Klan. 2/3 of the people that he killed at Jonestown were black people. And yet, all of these people that aided and abetted Jones, George Moscone, who was the mayor of San Francisco, put Jones on the Housing Commission in San Francisco, and very quickly, Jones became the chairman of the Housing Commission. In other words, he was the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco, in effect.
Yeah.
This is a guy who a year or two later was a landlord to people in South America, and he killed almost all of them. And yet they made him effectively the largest landlord in the city of San Francisco. And the people that aided and abetted him and made him immune from any sort of prosecutorial, investigations or any sort of scrutiny or oversight, those people are honored in San Francisco. And yet a guy like Abraham Lincoln, his name is coming off the school. I just think this is a group, this is a people. I mean, I call it Cult City. The name of the book is Cult City. And that's kind of what it is. It's a very cultish kind of behavior. And that's kind of a running theme through a lot of the books that I write.
Do you think the left wing, especially the progressive left wing and the cancel culture that we see today, is it reminds me of kind of just a mass movement of like a mob mentality. Like, oh, if you say something out of touch with how far left we go, we're gonna cancel you. Like J.K. Rowling said something about transgenders, yeah, that they're not real women or something, and she got attacked viciously, like really.
Well, it's easy to cancel someone like myself. Like, I'm a small person. I guess not that easy, because I'm sort of writing for the conservative press, and occasionally I'll write something for mainstream publication. But someone like J.K. Rowling, I mean, she is probably the best-selling living author today, and maybe by the time she dies, she'll be the best-selling author of all time. I like Danielle Steele and some others wrote, have sold a lot of books, but she has, I mean, just sold an amazing amount of books. So the idea that you're going to cancel her, it seems rather ridiculous. John Cleese made some remarks, I think, in support of her, and I think he made some remarks in support of Brexit. People trying to cancel John Cleese, octogenarian Monty Python member, as if he cares. I mean, that's the thing they don't get, is if you are, John Cleese's age, you don't really care what other people think of you, and all this and you're all. I don't know that he's immune from cancel culture, but he's done his part. He's already, his work on Earth is done, and he's sort of resting. So I think he could probably care less. And that's the thing with older people, is they tend to care less about your opinion, and therefore they give their opinions a little bit more freely. And I think with someone like J.K. Rowling, how do you cancel her? I mean, she seems too big to cancel, right? I don't know.
Well, I think let's play the hypothetical game. I think even if somebody like Oprah Winfrey suddenly, for some reason, if she turned conservative, I think people would still attack her, because she's not she's a coon, she's a Uncle Tom, and all these terms. I had a conservative guest on, and that's even 10 years ago, in 2008, like, because she was a black conservative, people would call her, liberals would call her the N-word. Like, this is
they would say this about Oprah Winfrey?
No, they would say to the conservative friend, to my conservative
friend.
So now, 10 years later, when it seems like the atmosphere is much worse, I think.
Yeah, all those terms that they throw out, they're so ugly, and I just, my heart hurts when I hear them, and it hurts whenever someone says it. But the idea that you're going to think it's okay to use terms like that on someone because they don't believe the same things that you do, but when you hear someone use terms like that might be an ignorant person, you're going to jump all over them rather than sort of educate them and say, hey, this isn't the right way to go. It makes you think whether they really care about racism, or do they care about sort of using racism as an ideological brickbat. I think most people probably have the sense enough not to use those harsh terms about their ideological enemies. But obviously, Twitter's a big place, and there's usually one or two, right? There's usually a couple of them.
There's usually a couple hundred of I every day I can every day I can see, like, if I don't know if you know James Lindsay. He studies a lot of the intersectionality and a lot of the critical theory stuff, and he can come up every day with it. And it's so much so that now Facebook, this is another problem. They're starting to muzzle him. They're starting to censor his speech. And what do you think is behind that?
Well, I think people who have never been exposed to conservative ideas or just heterodox ideas that are maybe not concerned, because no one's going to say J.K. Rowling's a right winger or John Cleese is a right winger, and these are just people that are saying, or Ricky Gervais, or any of these people that have said heterodox things, or you know, a long time ago, Rick Mail would say some, you know, he's since passed, but he said some rather heterodox things. I don't think anyone would confuse these people for me. Like, my views are very different from them, but because they have, you know, one or two opinions that sort of wandered off the reservation, all of a sudden they become subject to cancel culture. I think the reason for that is that a lot of people coming up, particularly the younger generation, weren't exposed to ideas that differ from their own. And that's one of the reasons why they're horrible at debate and they need to shout everyone down, is because usually to be pretty good at debate, you have to at least have a familiarity with what your opponent's going to say. I have had the good fortune, I guess, of, you know, I grew up in Massachusetts. I spent part of my time in Vermont. These are the two states that voted most overwhelmingly for Joe Biden in the most recent election. And I lived for, you know, over a decade in Washington, D.C., which is one of the bluest, most democratic cities in the entire country. So pretty much everywhere I've lived my entire life, I've been outnumbered. You know, I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard and MIT are, and almost everyone there is, you know, has a really extreme left-wing view. And so I have had, I'll say it's the good fortune of being around a lot of people who disagree with me. And I think I can, socially, I think I can hang with those people because I'm not one of these folks that almost like has a Tourette syndrome fit of having to inject their opinion in everything. There's so much to life beyond politics, things like literature and cinema and sports and, you know, all sorts of things that are a lot of fun that have nothing to do with politics. But unfortunately, what we're talking about now are people that have a total politics mindset, and everything it revolves around the political. I don't know if you guys saw the Super Bowl over there, and you probably get different ads, but half of the ads that we got here in the United States, they were not commercials advertising a company's product. They were advertising how committed these companies were to social justice. And the ad that was the most glaring was a 2-minute ad from Jeep, which was about Bruce Springsteen, a guy who's been trashing Donald Trump for several years, trashing Republicans for as long as I can remember. I went to a concert of his once in Orlando. He stops the concert and starts talking about affirmative action and racial preferences and why they need that in Florida. So he's been doing this his whole life, and yet he gives a 2-minute lecture on national television how we all finally have to reunite. We all got to come together. You know, easy for you to say when the Democrats are running things, because he wasn't up much for unity before. So a lot of people saw that and saw some of the other ads and just thought it was so overwhelming that they shut the TV off. And so the Super Bowl had the worst ratings it's had for over a decade. You know, part of it because the game was not so great, but a big part of it, it was just people go to sports to tune that out. They go to sports. If they wanted to watch MSNBC, they turn on us on MSNBC, but they don't want ESPN to be on MSNBC. And I think that's what we got a lot with the Super Bowl here in America, is it became politicized. It became a very political event. And we've seen that with late night television. We've seen that with award shows. We've seen that with comedy. And I think there's a corruption of purpose for a lot of these people trying to make things political that just inherently aren't political.
Right. It seems like there's a corruption of the whole academia of the Western world, and that's where the ideas originate, in the academia. And I wanted to read something. Thomas Sowell used to write a column, and back in 2004, when you published The Intellectual Morons, I'm sure you're aware of this, but I just wanted to read this out loud. He said, Intellectual Morons by Daniel J. Flynn was one of this year's best books It shows how the intelligentsia have for years fallen for unbelievably stupid and often tragic notions, everything from environment to communist dictators. And if you get praise from Thomas Sowell, that for me is like the highest praise you can get.
Well, I felt the same way. And one of the reasons I felt the same way is that we didn't solicit that. Nobody, I don't even know if we sent him a book. He said that in December, and I think the book came out in September of 2004. I think it was he wrote a column about the year's best books, and I felt so flattered that he included mine. But usually when you look on the back, the dust jacket of a book and you see the blurbs, oftentimes those are solicited. You go to a bunch of people and say, hey, will you read this book and have a reaction? We'll put it on the back of the book. No one went to him and said that. He just did it on his own, and it came out of the blue. And it was so flattering for that reason, but also so flattering because I had read so many of his books and been such an admirer of Thomas Sowell over the years. In fact, I recently read his autobiography and a couple other books of his. But usually the books that I'd read by that point, I'd read a lot of Thomas Sowell by 2004. So that was very flattering. Well, William F. Buckley praised the book too, but someone went to him and said, hey, could you give a blurb for this? Which, I felt flattered at that, like that he would do that. But the fact that no one went to Sowell and he just did it on his own, that really made me feel great. And it makes me feel great 17 years later. So.
And there's also an author called David R. Hawkins who highly, in a way, praised your book by, okay, I don't know if I want to explain it here, but basically he uses a map of consciousness scale, and your book came out like and highly reasoned, like in a range of wisdom, let's say. Your book came
Really?
out. Yeah. Because
I'm not familiar with this.
Okay, so I just wanted to say, so this is the first you heard of it, then?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think things unfortunately have gotten worse since you wrote the book in 2004. I started university last year, and things like critical theory, intersectionality, all of these things are now embedded, especially in the social sciences. Because one of the classes I take is a theater class, and all of the political analysis is from the critical theory kind of juncture, and I understand that comes from Marcuse, right?
Well, I think that the cultural Marxism certainly comes from Marcuse. And, one of the things that he said, he had this idea called liberating tolerance. And he wrote an essay. I think the essay was called Repressive Tolerance or something like that. And he said that, liberating tolerance was to basically have tolerance for ideas that you agree with and stamp out regressive ideas and conservative ideas, right-wing ideas. And I'm butchering the exact quote, but the gist of it was that. And obviously, the rebuttal to that is, well, even Hitler and Stalin were tolerant of ideas that they agreed with, right? The true test of tolerance is to be tolerant of ideas that you don't agree with. And I think a lot of people looked at Marcuse, what he wrote in the 1960s, and that kind of became the marching orders, the kind of cultural Marxism. He basically looked at Marx and saw Marx was sort of suited for an economic analysis with things like the theory of surplus value and owning the means of production and all these central tenets of Marx. And he thought, well, how do we apply that into this new age? This sort of he wrote a book called Eros and Civilization, and he's also the guy that coined the phrase "make love, not war." So you know what kind of age he was talking about. He was talking about the 1960s.
Yeah.
And he used Marxism and applied it to things like race and sex. And I think that's what you see now. When people are talking about white privilege or male privilege, this is a Marxist concept that's been twisted a little by people like Herbert Marcuse. And so his influence is so great that most of the people now, saying check their privilege or, talking about social justice and all that, they're getting these ideas second or third hand from Marcuse, from a guy they probably have never heard of before, but yet the ideas are so familiar. So I chose Marcuse as the first guy that I was going to write about in in my book, Intellectual Morons, for that reason, because I saw how influential he was even in 2004. But you bring up a great point that this stuff has gone on steroids since then. Back then, we called it political correctness. And now we're calling it, what are we calling it? Woke or social justice or critical race theory or intersectionality. But a lot of it sort of stems back to that. And maybe that's a simplification of it. But, a lot of it stems back to Marcuse and the people that what's called the Frankfurt School, the people that he came out of Germany with.
It seems like it's a rebranding of Marxism, because Marcuse, I don't think you wrote about this, that he didn't believe anymore in the Marxist uprising of everybody, and this never happened that everybody would uprise. And I don't think there's been a single case in the history. There's always been
small number of people, right?
Yeah, Lenin and all, they storm in, they take over, and then by force they rule, and they still.
But isn't that what's happening now, though? But when you talked earlier about Twitter and this sort of cancel culture, that's a really small number of people making a lot of noise, and they wield a lot of power. It's a lot like what you're talking about with these revolutions.
Do you think intellectual diversity is, because I feel like you have to play their game. So diversity is one of the key words. So if I go to the university and I say, hey, I need a intellectual diversity chair, do you think that would go over well?
Well, it hasn't thus far. You can try it, but I don't see that going over well. I mean, unfortunately, the kind of diversity that you've had at universities for the last 30, 40 years is a kind of diversity that looks like the United Nations, but thinks like, an Ann Arbor coffee house. In other words, it's diversity that's skin deep. It's diversity that's about how you look on the outside and not what you think about on the inside. And unfortunately, when you talk about intellectual diversity on college campuses, it's really non-existent. And to the extent that it exists, it's just sort of someone may have gotten tenure and then later had an epiphany and thought, their ideas were wrong. Usually they don't get tenure if they're conservatives. Usually they sort of have an epiphany at a later date. So they're very good at keeping conservatives out. And of course, as far as faculty, so you have to ask yourself, if they're doing that with faculty, what are they doing with grading? How do they grade fairly? Because they're certainly not hiring fairly. When I've gone to campuses to speak, now I don't do too much speaking anymore on college campuses, but for a time, a couple of years, I was probably speaking more than any other conservative in the United States, around 2005, 2006. Mm-hmm. Doing like 60, 70 dates a year. And part of it is because I was so cheap. I wasn't asking for much, and sometimes I'd ask for nothing. But back then, the experiences that I had, when I organized a conference at Columbia, they kicked us out. We had to have the conference in November in a park overlooking in a little alcove overlooking Morningside Park, and that the students were chanting, "Ha ha, you're outside. We don't want your racist lies," and saying, that this is a place where homeless people eat and piss. It's appropriate. You're having a conference here. And, they were taunting us. Ivy League school, we'd paid thousands of dollars to rent space from them. And halfway through the conference, because Ward Connerly, an African-American who was opposed to racial preferences and led the fight against racial preferences in California, he spoke Friday night. There was an insane protest from these people. And when we came back for the conference Saturday morning, they said, you can't come in. They said, you can have your conference. You can come in and have your conference. We're not censoring you. Your audience can't come in, though. And this was their creative attempt at censorship. Now, that's what I've experienced on college campuses. When I went to Berkeley, I had someone moon me. They tried to rip the microphone cord out of the wall. They were yelling so loudly, no one could hear me speak. And when after the event, they took some of the booklets that I had authored about Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was this sort of Black Panther guy who murdered a policeman in 1981. They had a book burning. This is at Berkeley, the home of the free speech movement in the 1960s. In 2000, they were having a book burning with my writings as the kindling, and I think they also burned an American flag, which is kind of obligatory there. But I've had so many instances at Connecticut College and so many other schools where the reception, people pulling fire alarms at Michigan State, that became old after a while. And part of it was that I started writing books that didn't really have the campus appeal. I mean, if you write a book like Why Left Hates America or Intellectual Morons, those are sort of tailor-made for campuses.
Yes.
My interests started going in a different direction. And so part of the fact that I don't speak at campuses so much is the stuff that I'm interested in, maybe that they're not as interested in. But the other reason was I just got frustrated with it. And I felt like, what was the point? Kind of like, not comparing myself to the Beatles, but when the Beatles stopped playing, they said, what was the point of playing if no one could hear you? What is the point of speaking if everyone's trying to shout you down? It gets really frustrating to get in an airplane, go 3,000 miles, try to reason with people, and their response is shouting like barbarians. That would seem the opposite of what you would expect in an intellectual community. But yet that's what you find when you're a conservative and go to a college campus. And you don't have to be some provocateur like Milo or, I don't know, Ann Coulter or someone like that, someone that's kind of looking for, a little bit more combative than I am,
Right.
maybe. And they're great and they're very intelligent people, but you don't have to be someone like that to have that kind of reaction. You could be the most staid person in the world, and they're going to react like that because they have this visceral contempt for conservative ideas.
Right. Well, what if I say I feel marginalized because there's not enough intellectual diversity? Like, or yeah, I think you have to use some of their lingo, because that's the lingo they understand, and then to play jujitsu with that. For example, maybe I shouldn't say this in public, but in class, we were talking about race. And nobody there was black. So I said, well, since nobody here is black, we can't speak for black people. So I'm going to say what Morgan Friedman said about race. And he said, to, I think one of the Wallace guy, Mike Wallace, he said, I'm going to stop calling you a white man, and you're going to stop calling me a black man, like things like that. So I presented that in class and things like that. I think it's unfortunate that you still have to use race, because I think the critical theory made it so that if the more you're a victim, somehow the higher your opinion is valued. And that's the tragedy of our time, because I got an email from the university just today. They're trying to they think the curriculum is too Eurocentric, and they wanted to diversify, but they mean not intellectual diversity. They mean just skin deep, which is just but the opinion would be the same, like one step, like all intersectionality, all the same. And that's a big problem.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why we read someone like Shakespeare is it is universal. I mean, something like Othello can teach you something about race, but really it can teach you something about betrayal, because everyone's had a Iago in their life, someone who really, stabbed them in the back. You can learn a lot about gender stuff from, certainly like Measure for Measure, but also like the comedies like As You Like It. That's the one I think with Ganymede as being Rosalind, and a girl pretending to be a boy, pretending to be a girl, and a guy pretending to be a girl, pretending to be a boy. That kind of stuff. There's all sorts of things that in some ways fit in nicely with this whole race, gender fixation that you can get from someone like Shakespeare. And yet Shakespeare is one of those dead white males that they want to, I don't know about expunge, because it'd be hard to, I don't know. I'm sure there are people that go through 4 years of college that don't read any Shakespeare, but I think that might still be hard to do. I hope it's still hard to do. I mean, but that's kind of what they're trying to do, is to squeeze out people like that. Could you really have an education without reading Shakespeare? Could you really have an education without reading the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle? I don't think you can.
Daniel, I think it's entirely possible. I think nowadays university, a lot of them, you don't have to do that at all. What do you think? If you study gender studies, they're not even covering that at all. They're just like, oh, this is not relevant.
Well, I mean, I guess what I mean by that is that on one level, I hope that that's not true. But on another level, what I mean is that you're really getting ripped off if you get a college degree and you don't study any of that. The best that's ever been thought and said, as Matthew Arnold put it, that if you're not getting the best that's ever been thought and said, and you're getting, 80% of the stuff you're getting is current intellectual fads and fashions, you're getting ripped off. You wasted your money. You should have stayed home.
So I used to have a friend that was really big into Michel Foucault. And he's another one of those postmodernist guys that tried to. Did he try to rebrand Marxism, or what was his deal?
I think that was a little bit different. Foucault was more about power, and you would call him a postmodernist. And I guess I think part of the reason people call him a postmodernist, apart from them using the language themselves, when you even look at the guy's look, with this, she has a very striking look with this shaved bald head. But nowadays so many guys shave their heads, but back then it was a little Kojak-y to do that. There wasn't too many guys doing that, and so he shaved his head and he would wear this turtleneck and some interesting looking glasses, and he was just a very interesting looking guy. Foucault, was about power, and postmodernism is about power. And a branch of postmodernism, of course, is deconstructionism, which basically creates mischief on two levels. One level is it tells the audience basically to read into things whatever you want to read into them. And they claim they're just doing a deeper reading, but it's really just people projecting their own sort of desires, ideological or otherwise, onto a text. So it creates that kind of mischief. The other kind of mischief is it invites writers to write in this very opaque jargon that nobody can understand and is just prone to interpretation. And so they don't really communicate very effectively. That's why I don't think it's really an ideology built for the long haul. But how this works in practice, I mean, there was a guy named Alan Sokal years ago who said, I'm going to write a nonsense article and I'm going to just say a bunch of things that don't make sense, like the idea of equality and feminism that has, really influenced mathematics and the study of numbers, and all sorts of these just harebrained ideas that these modern social things really were sort of key to understanding all of these, the basic ideas in learning. And the basic thing about the articles, it didn't make any sense. If you read it in a literal way, it didn't make any sense. He submitted it to this journal, I think it was called Social Text or something like that, and it was accepted for publication. And he announced after it was printed that this was all a hoax, it was all a joke, and people were really mad at him. But I think he did he exposed that field for what it is, which is just a bunch of nonsense masquerading as wisdom. And he did them a favor, really. But everyone was laughing at those people. But of course, it's hard for people to laugh at themselves. The deconstructionists were not laughing at themselves. But this is something, deconstruction, postmodernism, it's something that's influenced not just the way people read literature, but if you think about, this guy applied it to the sciences, but there was a public park created on postmodernist principles in France. And there was a running track in the park that went through like a bar room. There was a bridge that abruptly stopped. That didn't go anywhere. Cost $200 million. Cost $200 million. It cost a lot of money. And you have to ask yourself, like, why did they do this? This makes no sense. And I think that's an apt symbol of what postmodernism is. Or when, in music, when people say that, Beethoven's Fifth, they call it the Rape Symphony. Not a whole lot of sense there, but they're using these deconstructionist principles, applying it to something that has nothing to do with rape, but because they're so preoccupied with women's issues, they will project that on them. And deconstructionism empowers them to do that. And so that's what that's all about.
Right. So in intersectionality, I think took postmodernism, but with the only absolute, basically, that the white male is the worst. So if you're a white male, then you have no, you couldn't say anything because your opinion is not as valued as if somebody is transgender, if they're black, if they're disabled, all of these things. And that's problematic because it goes anti-equality. And again, it's not what Martin Luther King fought for. He was fighting for judging people on the content of their character, not on the color of the skin. So
yeah. Well, yeah, they've turned everything on its head, and I think that it's kind of the very people that they claim to be privileged are the people that are least privileged in their framework. In other words, you're not, just as you say, you're not really able to speak freely if you're a white male, which would be the people they're saying are really privileged. But in their framework, if you're under their rules in a classroom or wherever, you have the least power. And, I mean, someone said, and I forget who it was, said that if you want to see who's powerful in a society, see who you can't make a joke about. And I forget exactly who said that, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. Like, if you were in mixed company, if you were in a crowd, who can you and cannot be the punchline? And if you start thinking about who can't be the punchline, those are the people who have the real power in society.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned the writing very muffled, and I think it was a student of Michel Foucault, Derrida, and he wrote, "Therefore, we will be incoherent without systematically resigning ourselves to incoherence." What?
Well, you start to, and I think the whole reason to write something like that is for someone to try to decipher what he's trying to say. And if you start to try to decipher what he's trying to say, you start to become a deconstructionist as well. And so in a sense, you can see how effective something like that would be. If you ran into language like that often enough, and people do if they read academic journals, you can't help become a deconstructionist yourself, because you're trying to find meaning in things that inherently don't have any of it.
Right. You just project your own meaning on there. I think a lot of it, in my own opinion, was just people that had some unresolved issues, and they took him out on constructing a theory around it. Basically, that's what it seems to me.
I'm sure that that's a big part of it. And I think that's with a lot of, I mean, there's the old feminist mantra, the personal is the political. And people say that without shame as though it's a good thing. But, the way I view politics is that you want to transcend who you are and look at people's rights and protect their rights. I mean, one of the things that I've always thought, I've never smoked a cigarette in my life, but I look at the rights of smokers in this country over the last quarter century, and they've just been decimated. They're second-class citizens. Now, I don't stand up for their rights because I'm ever going to smoke a cigarette. I never will. I just stand up for their rights because they have rights, and we should defend people's rights who are not necessarily our own interest. Unfortunately, I think what stuff we're talking about with regard to postmodernism, when it's about power, there's always a lot of selfishness to that. Yeah. And it's not when it's about power, it's not about principle. And I wish people would look at politics more from principle, and not to impose Jesus on politics. But when Jesus said, treat others the way you would want to be treated, that's a pretty good guide for everything, even in politics. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Put the shoe on the other foot. And I think a lot of these people that are fixated by power, you heard last summer, everyone was saying, George Floyd, rest in power. What does that mean, rest in power? Rest in peace. But I would love to be free. That would be my ideal, is to be free. And but some people's ideal is power. They want to tell other people what to do. And that's not my dream at all. But evidently, it's the dream of a lot of people.
You mentioned Jesus, and I don't think maybe I haven't read enough of your books. What's your background as far as religious? I know you went to the, I think, Navy or the Army.
I was in the Marines, and in fact, when I was in the Marines, at least at Paris Island, I was a Catholic lay reader. I'm a Catholic. I don't know that I'm the best Catholic in the world. Sometimes I run a good streak of a few months of not missing church, but that's with the COVID and all that. That's been harder to do. But I'm probably the guy that should sit in the back of the church and not tell anyone about what this means or what that means, because I'm not great at that. And I'm the last person that's going to be out there saying, well, you should be this or you should be that, because I haven't figured it all out myself. For me, it's not really much of an intellectual thing. It's just kind of a soul thing, a thing in the heart. And I don't know that you can persuade someone else what they should have in their heart, what they should have in their soul. You can persuade someone intellectually. I don't know that you can persuade someone about something, a matter of the soul. That's got to come from within.
Do you think part of you not being woke would be that, or any other person, that they have religion? Because wokeness seems to become its own religion. So I feel like people that are not religious are in college are way more likely to become woke than people that are.
Well, yeah. I mean, I wrote a book called The Conservative History of the American Left. And originally its title was going to be something, I forget something about the religion, politics as a religion or something like that. But basically that woke stuff is the religion for people who don't have religion. And they like to think of themselves as secular, as not prone to superstition, as not prone to the groupthink of maybe like the Catholic Church or something like that. But in reality, this is their religion. And think about something like dating. It used to be taboo in this country, at least, to have things like interracial dating. And to some extent, it was taboo to have interreligious dating. Those things are no longer taboo. And it's great that they're not, like great that a white guy can get with a black girl, great that a guy can get with an Asian girl. Great, go with who you love. We're more free. But I think what's replaced that, there are still taboos, and what's replaced that for a lot of people is dating within sort of transcending the sort of political differences in dating. So you'll see on, they've done some studies, and also they quote from dating sites where people will say, well, no Trump supporters or no left wingers or no whatever. And that phenomenon is, I think, a sign of the times of where we're at. And where we're at is really at each other's throats, at least in the United States. And people want to be in their own little bubbles. They want to be reinforced, affirmed. They don't want to be challenged. Not that anyone wants to be challenged on a date. But it has become a religion. And I wrote about, in one of my books, Blue Collar Intellectuals, I write about a guy named Eric Hoffer. And he wrote a book called The True Believer around mid-century. And the point of The True Believer was to look at joiners, people who joined these causes, and their individuality was absorbed by the group. And they lost who they were as people, and they did all sorts of inhumane things. In that book, although it didn't, there were some contemporary examples. I think the reason why that book is so lasting is because it's eternal. And it's not giving all these examples from 1950 or whatever. But part of the reason it hit so well in 51 is that people had just had the experience of Hitler and Stalin, and we're obviously still experiencing Stalin. So it was germane to the times, but it wasn't mired in the times in the sense the examples and things that he used. Hoffer was a longshoreman, a guy who worked loading and unloading cargo off the docks in San Francisco.
Yep.
And lucky for him, someone gave his book to Dwight Eisenhower when he was still a general. He was photographed holding the book. People started writing about it, saying, people used to make fun of Eisenhower because he read a lot of cowboy fiction, and they thought he was dim-witted. And when they saw him with this book, they thought, oh wow, look what Eisenhower's reading, and everyone started talking about The True Believer, which really, to me, is one of the great books of the 20th century. And Hoffer is one of the great original thinkers of the 20th century. He's also maybe the most interesting character of the 20th century because Eric Hoffer not only wrote these great books, but he really wrote this character named Eric Hoffer. All of the things that he told us about himself, or at least a lot of the things, were certainly not true. The things we knew that were true were extremely interesting because we don't see too many guys who on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday are loading off shipping crates from boats on the shore, and then on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, they're writing in pencil in a little notebook all of their thoughts and saving these aphoristic thoughts for a later book. And that's what he did. He worked as a longshoreman, and he wrote these books. And he had sort of a revival in the 1960s because you had this, Eric Hoffer was kind of like a species that doesn't exist much anymore. He was a conservative Democrat. And when he saw all this uprising, cultural upheaval, really, in the San Francisco Bay Area where he lived in the 60s, he didn't know what, he wrote a lot about this, but I don't know that he totally knew what to make of it. He wrote that he sometimes walks down the street and he cannot tell the gender of the person that he's passing by. And this was shocking to him. I mean, I guess this is everyday life for us now. This was really shocking to him. He talked about all of these dope peddlers and ideological seducers and whoremongers and all these cult leaders that he would see in San Francisco. And he said, everywhere you look, you see human beings rot before they ripen. And I think that is one of the things, we talked about the book I most recently wrote called Cult City. And that's a very San Francisco-centric book. And one of the persons that saw what was coming was Eric Hoffer, saying that I see human beings rot before they ripen. And he was really kind of the other side of the 60s. He was someone who looked at what was going on outside and provided a rebuttal in real time. And I think that's why so many people sort of gravitated to him, not just in the 50s when Eisenhower did, but later in the 60s when Johnson and President Nixon did as well.
Yeah, I love Eric Hoffer, and I wish more people knew of him. When I was going to this one-year program before I'm going to uni now, I used to reference Hoffer quite a bit because none of the sociologists and stuff like that know even of his name. And I'm like, how can you not know who Eric Hoffer is? And also I think Thomas Sowell is really big into Eric Hoffer, and Thomas Sowell loves Hoffer as well. So I think great minds know great minds, and sometimes if you're in a postmodernist things, I think they just don't see Hoffer's work as attractive because it doesn't give him like one fix all. But Hoffer's work is just I think his work is unique in that in a small compact space, in one or two quotes, there's a lot there, and you can contemplate on it. It's almost like, maybe it's blasphemous to say, but it's almost like a prayer, like a very wisdom kind of thing that he puts on. And you like people, like I've seen people like in the reviews say that they had to put the book down and think about it for a little bit.
Well, he understood this himself, certainly. A lot of the French writers that he read, and I'll butcher the guy's name, but La Roche de Foucault, or maybe I'm getting his name wrong, but also Montaigne. And he was very much enamored in that aphoristic style that they wrote in. In other words, that there was usually something very pithy combined in a line or two. And so Hoffer obviously did that. He said things like, when you set yourself up to be your brother's keeper, be careful because you might become his jail keeper. Or he said it in a better way than that. Or every movement, every movement ends up as a racket, a cult, or a corporation. Something to that effect. All sorts of things. We lie loudest when we lie to ourselves.
Right.
All sorts of things that are just blow you away and knock you over in 5 or 6 words or 10 or 15 words. And his ability to do that, it's amazing because now people are using Twitter, and it started out 140 characters or less. I don't know that anyone could have been better on Twitter than Eric Hoffer. Now, I don't know that I've ever seen anything worth reading on Twitter, but if you had a guy like Eric Hoffer, he could use that format. He really was a man ahead of his times. And he famously wrote, that he never wrote a book above more than 200 pages. And he famously wrote, big books give authors a place to hide, thin books, there's no place to hide, something to that effect. And I think that that's true about him because it's dense and it's crammed in there. And you bring up the deconstructionists and the postmodernists, he's really the opposite of them because what they're trying to do is hide behind words that don't really have a whole lot of meaning. They can write something really long with a lot of jargon, with a lot of ambiguity. And a guy like Eric Hoffer, he is coming at you, not indirectly, but in a very direct way. And he's not using words like may or perhaps. It's very direct. And I think for those reasons, anyone who's read Eric Hoffer is hooked or will never be the same. And the people that haven't read him, like you're talking about these folks, they haven't read him because there's a prejudice in academia that you have to write like a moron to be intelligent. And I just, I don't know why that is the case. I mean, there's a lot of professors that can write really well, but they do this in spite of what they're trained, how they're trained to write in their professions. Even historians, a lot of them write like, you write because you want to communicate to someone reading it. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why someone would write to communicate the idea that I'm so smart that you don't understand this. You want to write. want to write to be understood.
Right.
And I don't know that there's a lot of people in academia that don't do that.
Right. There's I was actually watching today this there was this teacher writing from the University of Chicago, and he said you don't write because what you say is important or persuasive. You write because it's valuable to the reader. But he was making the point that you always have to, like in school, he was making the point that in school people are paid to read what you read, and this is going to stop once you leave university. Okay, this is going to stop, and obviously you know that better than anybody because you're a writer. So you have to be, so what you're writing has to be valuable to somebody enough that they pay $15, or otherwise is you wasted all that time for research, for writing.
I think you've hit on, or that guy's hit on a really important point, that maybe one of the many reasons that a lot of academics don't write well is that when they are communicating, so often they're communicating to a captive audience, that they don't have to hone it because they have to be there, or they can skip class or whatever, but they have to be there. Whereas people that write in a commercial way, like myself, if you don't write to communicate, you're not going to last. And I really think oftentimes they're doing academics are doing something different than a guy like myself. And I think a lot of academics think, well, I can do what this guy can do because I'm so bright or whatever. And maybe they are bright, but you have to be bright enough to be able to communicate with a mass audience, and not to communicate the idea that you're better and smarter than the mass audience, because the mass audience is not going to fall for that. They're not going to go for that. They're going to read someone else.
I have a friend that was really big into reading. I think he's still big into reading, but he said that because he's from New York, so he worked construction and stuff like that, and he said that physical labor like grounded him, and it seems like the parallel is Hoffer's work, obviously, his life, that he was working all his life, and I think you touched upon that in your the blue collar intellectuals, because if you are a person that worked with normal people and like a normal job, especially a physical labor job, and then you go into academia, you have a different mindset than somebody who has never worked lots, even as a dishwasher, a day in his life,
Well, I think that's true. And that's kind of what the book was about, Blue Collar Intellectuals, about intellectuals who, because of their real world experience, were able to connect with and uplift the everyman, rather than the intellectuals that we see today who are more interested in communicating among their own group. Milton Friedman would be an excellent example of that. When Milton Friedman was young, he scooped ice cream in his parents' ice cream parlor. He went to Rutgers, and back then you had to wear a certain color sock if you were a freshman. So he sold socks and ties door to door. He used to buy the books back, the textbooks from the kids, and sell them for a profit to the local. It was an early version of Barnes and Noble.
Wow.
So he had all these entrepreneurial schemes, and it shouldn't shock us that a guy like Milton Friedman would understand the economy far better than, let's say, John Maynard Keynes, who, when he was in college, he was hanging around this kind of, or at least when he was, even when he was a little older, he's hanging around with this kind of avant-garde group of people called the Bloomsbury Group, which was kind of like this bisexual clique where they had all these Marxist ideas. That's a lot far removed. It's a lot more ethereal than what Milton Friedman was dealing with at Rutgers. And so we shouldn't be surprised that when they have their various economic philosophies, Milton Friedman's is more grounded in reality. That he had this, there was a famous quote that he wrote in an academic journal, and I'll butcher it right now, but basically that the value of a theory, of an economic theory, is tied to how well that theory performs in the real world. And if it fails, it doesn't matter how well that theory works inside of your head. That's not the test of a theory. The theory is how well it works outside in the real world. And it shouldn't shock us that a guy who, peddled socks door to door to make ends meet. And he also, he worked as a waiter in college for payment of a lunch. He got a free lunch in tips for working as a waiter. A guy like that would have an opinion like that it's got to be tethered to working in the real world. It shouldn't shock us. And then a guy like Keynes would have the views that he did. Or you look at someone like Marx. Eric Hoffer had a wonderful quote about Marx. He said that, I've often thought how it is that Marx could have all of these theories about the working man and not have worked a day in his life and not worked in a factory and not done any of this work. I figure if he can do that, then I can have a few thoughts about intellectuals. And I always thought that was great.
That's a theme. Eric Hoffer and Thomas Sowell and a few other writers have written books that might seem anti-intellectual, but it's only because intellectual, I think Hoffer said that intellectuals are more susceptible to power than any group. Like if you give a military general power and he's satisfied if you obey, but not the intellectual. He wants you to go down on your knees and praise the one that loves what you hate. And no, what's he say? I'm butchering this, but there's a quote of this on YouTube, and basically he wants the intellectual wants you to love it even though you hate it, basically.
Well, there's been a lot of, and I forget who it was who said this, but there was a lot of different, it might have been Raymond Aron, or I forget, but basically making the point that even though the reason that intellectuals weren't turned off by the persecution of intellectuals in communist countries is that at least those countries valued them and saw their importance. They either saw their importance enough to put them in charge of something, or they saw their importance enough to kill them or send them to the gulag like Solzhenitsyn. Whereas in Western culture, most people just go about their lives and kind of ignore intellectuals. They don't have a place of high standing in the West, or at least they don't have a place standing as high as they would like to be. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of them are, it might be a small reason, but I think that's one of the reasons why they are alienated from Western civilization, and why they were attracted to repressive regimes, because at least in those regimes, they viewed the intellectuals as very important people to put in charge of things, or important people to put in front of a firing squad.
But it seems like nowadays the social trends go towards having an intellectual in charge. I think Obama was kind of the start of that, and maybe the ending of that. But Biden is, I guess Biden is not really an intellectual. He's
no one's going to mistake him as an intellectual. But you bring up a point with Obama. Obama taught at a law school in Chicago, and I'm certain he views himself as an intellectual, and maybe he is. I mean, he's certainly not a dumb man. He's certainly an intelligent man. But I think the Obama, aside from the novelty of the first black president and the fact that he had some charisma, he had a way of speaking initially in 07 and 08 that really brought crowds to their feet, and they really loved it. When he got into office, he often spoke in the sort of pedagogical manner that he was descending from Mount Olympus and deigning to address the plebes. And I don't know where he got off track, but I really think that he once he became president, I guess if you were a critic, you'd say, well, there was this holy roller quality to some of his speeches on the campaign trail, but that ended once he became president. Maybe he felt like he needed to be presidential, but he really gave these professorial lectures as if he is up here and everyone else is down here. And I think that's one of the reasons that people just, a lot of people couldn't stand the guy. I mean, a lot of people loved him, obviously, but a lot of people couldn't stand him. And I think that condescending way was one of the reasons why people didn't, a lot of people were turned off from him.
I think that's, it seems to be a more and more common attitude, because it's basically an intellectual attitude of, I know better than the small people, the common plebs. I know better than you. So I should tell you what to do. You don't know how to take care of yourself. I'm gonna tell you, and that comes from Eric Hoffer predicted this, and now it's playing out because a lot of the intellectuals Trump was not intellectual per se, but he had intellectuals. He still had the intellectuals around the governments, around the like running the State Department and stuff like that in the government itself. And So okay, let's talk about Trump since I'm mentioning that. So what was your opinion on him winning? Because I thought it was kind of improbable, but I really wanted him to win. So and then he won.
I thought there was a chance he could win.
Yeah.
And I had a brother that spent a lot of time in the Midwest, and he kept on saying, "You're not going to believe it. Every road, every house has a Trump sign on them," and something was brewing. But I didn't think it was going to be enough for him to win. And but looking back on it, I mean, the way I look at presidential elections is always, in my lifetime at least, the more likable, vibrant, colorful personality always wins. And there's no exception to that in my lifetime. And sometimes it's just the fact that it's the fresher face that wins. But, you know, like, who is the guy you'd rather have a beer with? I mean, John Kerry or George W. Bush? Who's the guy that's in Technicolor? John McCain or Barack Obama? I mean, clearly Obama was the guy that you were going to remember on your TV screen, and John McCain was going to fade in with everything else. And if you look back at 2016, I don't know that anyone would like voluntarily want to spend time with Hillary Clinton. She comes across as kind of a nag and an unhappy woman. And Trump comes across, you know, sometimes he comes across like he has Tourette syndrome. I mean, sometimes he comes across like he has a personality disorder, but mostly he comes across as the life of the party, as a guy that's funny and that's going to light up the room. You know, maybe he'll darken the room too, but he's going to light up the room. And I think looking back on it, people vote like that. And also he was smart enough to correct the Republican Party's mistakes. I don't know that he was smart enough to correct his own mistakes, but he looked at Romney, he looked at George W. Bush, he looked at McCain, and he saw that they were pushing a lot of ideas that were not popular. The Iraq War, however unpopular Saddam Hussein was, or however popular it was in the beginning, you know, very quickly people realized that that had nothing to do with 9/11 and that it was a waste of money and resources, and we were killing a lot of people, and a lot of our guys were dying unnecessarily. So it became a big drain on the United States, but yet you had people like Romney and McCain and Bush doubling down on it and say that's the kind of foreign policy we want to pursue. Immigration was certainly an issue where, you know, 80% of the Republican Party thought this was a bad thing for this country, that you're allowing people to come in without, you know, any sort of limitations.
Yeah. And
the small percentage of people who were for it were usually people in power in the Republican Party. So that was an issue where he changed. I mean, trade, for better or worse, he saw that we were getting ripped off on a lot of these deals, and he wanted to change things. I don't know how much he changed things, but at least on foreign policy, I think he changed things quite a bit. So, you know, if you 1 out of 3 at a batting average, it's not terrible. But I guess the point is that he looked at where, and I guess a fourth thing was, you know, I mean, I'm conservative across the board pretty much, and some things I'm not conservative about, I guess. But on social issues, he realized that, you know, other than abortion, that train's left the station. And even on abortion, it's probably something better not to talk about, but just to act, to appoint the right judges and that kind of thing. Whereas on the other social issues, you know, the younger generation just, you know, people under the age of 35 just never going to see the world that same way. And so why are you wasting your time talking about gay marriage or talking about some of these other things? And so on those 4 issues, Trump looked at the Republican Party as an outsider and said, if I change on these 4 things and, you know, instead of acting like a punching bag, punch back, then maybe that's a winning strategy. And I think he was brilliant in doing that. And unfortunately for a guy like Trump, you know, all those things are true, but what's really, really true is that by force of personality, he won the White House. By force of personality, he lost the White House. So sometimes our greatest attributes are also our Achilles heel. Right. And I think with Trump, that's truer than most.
I think, yeah, he wasn't as optimistic as before, because I think partly because he was attacked every day more than I think. I was started following politics back in 2007, and I remember George Bush getting attacked, but nothing like Trump. Trump was attacked mercilessly every day, like 30 times as hard as Bush ever had, and still after the 4 years and after the corona, I think he was still mostly optimistic. I think he was in a way predicting that there might be some shenanigans during the vote. Do you think there was any? Because I remember, okay, because I had a bet riding on this, so I lost the bet, obviously. But I shouldn't have bet. I shouldn't have bet.
Don't gamble.
Right. Now I now get it. No, don't gamble anymore. But I remember. All right, we're back. We just had an hour break. There was technical difficulties. My fault, totally my fault. All right, so we're back now. Thank you again, Dan, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So I was saying that Bush was really attacked viciously every day, but nothing like Trump. I remember I was in Israel. I was in Israel for 3 months, and I went to the Holocaust Museum. And this is just before Trump got in. This is when he got elected and before he got in, when he was president-elect. And this woman was looking at this woman from America, this black woman from America. She must have been in her 50s or so. And she was looking at the scene of people lying dead on the street because of the Second World War and stuff. And because, Hitler brought this about. And she was like, oh, this is so sad because this reminds me of Trump. And I don't know why I got really ticked off by that. So, yeah.
Well, there's a delusional quality to the way the left has looked at Trump. And part of it, I don't know if they're disappointed that their predictions didn't come true because they're so wrapped up in ideology that something like that would confirm their biases, or if they're relieved or what it is. But, even something as small as like Paul Krugman saying the stock market was going to tank because of Trump. Obviously, the opposite happened. And they're all, they didn't think he was going to win, and he won. And I don't blame them for not thinking he was going to win. I mean, I thought he had a chance, but even when I said he had a chance, people would laugh at me. But no, he certainly had a chance. And maybe if him and Hillary have that election, maybe she beats him 6 times out of 10. I don't know. So he pulled the aces from the deck, and he did well that way. But on so many different things, they've been wrong about Trump. I mean, I recall when he said, he used not imprecise language, but when he said that the Obama administration bugged the Trump Tower, they bugged his campaign, or whatever it is that he said. Well, they did. They spied on his campaign.
Exactly.
And you can use semantics and say, oh, that they had a domestic surveillance warrant and all that. Well, they got that by fraudulent means. And they, for 4 years, or longer than 4 years even, they went through this conspiracy theory that the Russians had elected him president, which is rather rich, because when the Russians did do things in our politics, like, Alger Hiss or the Rosenbergs, or even Samuel Dickstein, who has a street named after him in Manhattan, a guy who was a paid agent of the Soviet Union, and in fact was the first head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. People don't want to admit that the first head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities was actually a communist agent, but he was. So the Russians certainly have involved themselves in our politics rather consistently for the last 100 years, starting with when they tried to take what was called Moscow Gold. John Reed tried to take that out of the Soviet Union and influence politics in the United States. Now, they haven't always been successful, but the idea that they, in cahoots with Donald Trump, that they elected him president, this was beyond bizarre. And you had supposedly, ostensibly responsible voices in the media running this idea for years and years and years, running a conspiracy theory. So they've been wrong about Trump on so many different things. I happen to find great faults with the way Trump conducted himself, basically from Election Day forward. And even prior to Election Day, I thought his performance in the first debate was disgraceful. And reminded
this election cycle, you mean?
This election cycle. Yeah. It reminded a lot of, everyone's been around someone that has like some kind of personality disorder, or shouts at you when speaks over you and shouts you down. And I felt like he reminded everyone that has had that dreadful experience of that experience and turned a lot of people off. And so I thought from that point forward, he's done a lot of things that I really greatly disagree with. But, you know, for the most part during his presidency, I think he was a very good president, in spite of the fact that he had all these forces aligned against him, like the media and other people that just wouldn't give him, for whatever reason, they had a visceral hatred for the guy and wouldn't give him a shot. There was no honeymoon period. There was no grace period where they said, well, let's let this guy try. You know, from the day of his election, people were talking about impeachment. From the day of his election, they were protesting his election. That's an odd thing for me. Like, you're going to protest an election? No, you know, it didn't go your way. Just, you know, so I didn't like that, but I also didn't like the fact that, you know, I guess he responded to that the way you would think a guy who dealt with all that would respond to it. I didn't care for the way he responded to the fact that he lost this election, and I know that's hard for a lot of people to swallow. But, you know, you lose by 74 electoral votes. It's not that close. You know, it's not 7 electoral votes. So, you know, I think we have, in the same way that Trump looked at Romney and Bush and McCain and tried to correct their faults moving forward, I think that the Republican Party should probably look at him and say, well, how did we mess up here? And a lot of those things, the ways we messed up, I think they're so Trump specific that I don't know that they're going to give us a whole lot of help moving forward. Right. But I also think he can be a positive role model in the sense, how do we look at Trump? What did he do right? And I think the main thing is, don't be a punching bag. Punch back. You know, that's what he did. And that's I hope he teaches Republicans that, because Mitt Romney and John McCain, those guys were human punching bags.
I know. A lot of that's the thing that was the biggest strength of Trump, because a lot of Republicans would have folded many times over. And
I would have.
Right.
I mean, most human beings would have. I mean, they came down on him like a ton of bricks. He seemed to thrive off that.
Right. This is his background, the power of positive thinking, you know, a couple with his experience in New York real estate. You're dealing with a lot of sharks in there. And then you come into politics, which is arguably even bigger sharks, but which is more backstabbers in politics, I guess. But also the coverage was incredibly 90% or more negative towards Trump. For me personally, I think it's still possible there was some shenanigans in the election, but I guess we will never know because they didn't investigate it. So it's now, somebody said to me that maybe this is a precedent going forward, that this is just the way the elections are going to be. You're just not going to know if this is, so some people are saying, what's the point of voting then?
Well, I think that's what happened in Georgia, unfortunately. Trump kept pushing this idea of fraud, and a lot of people who were his supporters, maybe it was just 5% or less, but they thought, what's the point of voting? And those 2 Senate candidates went down. Yeah. No, I think there's some common ground with what you're saying and what I'm saying, in the sense that, you know, I do think Biden won, but the idea of mail-in ballots, that's a bad idea. You know, Amazon wouldn't allow that for their union workers. Right. Why does the Washington Post endorse that for the United States of America? I don't know. The fact that they did some shenanigans and wouldn't allow the Green Party on the ballot, even though they qualified for the ballot, I think in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and maybe some other states. There were all sorts of things that were done prior to the election that made it easier for Biden to win and made it harder for Trump to win. And I think that voting should be somewhat easy, but I don't think it should be so easy that your neighbor should be able to do it for you, or your dead uncle should do it for you. And so I think those are reforms going forward that, you know, even if I agree with Democrats that Biden won, I don't think that we have I think we have a severely flawed system, and it shouldn't be that big of a deal for someone to show an ID when they vote. It shouldn't be that big of a deal for someone to show up to vote. And I think doing those things makes fraud more difficult to achieve.
Yeah. for me, it doesn't seem inconceivable that they could, because we're talking about multiple different states, multiple different cities where Republicans were not even allowed to get in to watch the vote and stuff. Like, anything can happen in those rooms. If you know the Republican watchers are like, you have to go outside, then how are you gonna know? Like, okay, this is my rant. Okay, rant over. Let's go. I want to touch upon. I haven't watched the movie, but there's a movie about Harvey Milk, and I think it makes him appear to be really, really a swell guy. And also, I looked up on Wikipedia, and he says he's really admired, almost like a cult icon for gay rights, because I think he was the first politician that came out gay, openly gay. So
he was one of them, certainly.
right. So but he was not as innocent a figure as the mainstream wants him to make out.
So in the book that I wrote, Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco, it delves into the relationship, mutually beneficial relationship between Jim Jones and Harvey Milk, and also between Jim Jones and a lot of other movers and shakers in San Francisco. And with Milk, Milk would attend occasionally People's Temple services. He would write these fawning letters to Jim Jones, once I have been here, how can I leave? That kind of thing. My name is written in stone for you and your people. And Jones, in return, gave him volunteers, conscripted volunteers from his church. He gave him a printing press, or sold it to him for $200. He gave him publicity from the People's Temple's newspaper, which was pretty influential at the time, gave him a pulpit to address, the 1,000 or so people that would attend People's Temple services. But Harvey Milk gave Jones something far more valuable in this sort of transactional politics that they were practicing, which was he gave him political cover and basically showed that powerful people thought Jim Jones was something good. So in the United States, when Jones believed that their Social Security checks had been cut off when they went to Guyana, Milk lobbied the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, which has since been reorganized, this guy Joseph Califano, and said that People's Temple was taking destitute youth and giving them skills, that it was a retirement community for which people in the United States, old people, would pay thousands of dollars to be in that retirement community. And it was solving the world's food crisis. This is at a time when Jonestown was actually importing food. I mean, imagine this. It's an agricultural project. It's a farm, essentially. And yet they have to import food to feed themselves. And he was saying they were solving the world food crisis. He's talking about a concentration camp. And he's describing it in glowing terms. He did the same thing with President Carter. Wrote to him and said that Jones was a man of the highest character. It was at least thought of that way in San Francisco. He wrote to the Prime Minister of Guyana and said, such greatness have I found in Jim Jones and People's Temple. So what this did in San Francisco, when powerful people stood up for Jones, it dissuaded the media, it dissuaded prosecutors from looking into his misdeeds. And what it did in South America was basically the same thing. Like, who are you going to believe? These very powerful, established people in the United States, like Willie Brown and Lieutenant Governor of California, Mervyn Dimley, who went down to South America and said he was so impressed by what he saw. And in fact, he was looking at a concentration camp, and he was saying, this place is so great. Are you going to believe those established, powerful people? Or are you going to believe these malcontents that have, these disgruntled malcontents, these poor people that have left People's Temple and have said all these awful things are going on? And so both in the United States and in Guyana, government officials basically looked the other way. And part of the reason they looked the other way is because Jones would give them volunteers and give them money and all this other stuff. Part of the reason they looked the other way is very powerful people vouched for Jim Jones, and Harvey Milk was certainly one of the biggest sycophants when it came to Jim Jones.
Was any of the politicians that are in high places now in San Francisco and California, were there any of them involved with this?
Yes, definitely. To a small extent, Dianne Feinstein, she when she was on the board of supervisors, they gave a certificate of honor to Jim Jones. But every week they were giving certificate of honors to different people, and I don't know that Feinstein was huge into Jim Jones.
Right.
Certainly Willie Brown, who was the former boyfriend of Kamala Harris, was one of the biggest boosters of Jones. In fact, when Jones went to Cuba, or was planning to go to Cuba in 1977 to visit Huey Newton, who was exiled there, the Black Panther, Brown wrote a letter on his behalf to Fidel Castro, having sort of a previous acquaintance with Castro, and urged Castro to extend a state visit to Jim Jones, as though Jones were the leader of a whole country. And he said that Jim Jones was a highly trusted brother in the struggle for liberation. Now, he also compared him to Martin Luther King. He presented him an award. He did all this. He was a big Jones backer. But when everything went down, he said, well, this, he sort of ran away. He acted as though that, like, you read his memoirs, and he talks about this as though he were like a detached observer and all these people were hoodwinked by Jones. He doesn't really mention that, yeah, I was one of the main ones hoodwinked by Jones. So obviously Willie Brown would be one. Jerry Brown, who was most recently governor, would have been another. I mean, he met with Jim Jones. Jones met with a lot of powerful people. He met with Rosalind Carter. She's the future First Lady of the United States. When she's coming to San Francisco to campaign for her husband in 1976, who wins the presidency, Jim Jones is the person who introduces her when she has a public speech. So this is highly odd that you have a cult leader who, within a couple of years murders 900 people, introducing the First Lady of the United States. Walter Mondale, when he comes, he's the vice president for the running mate of Carter. When he comes to campaign to San Francisco, Jones is one of the first persons he meets on the tarmac. I think most interestingly enough, there were a couple of characters in San Francisco politics, real power players, called the Burton brothers. Both of them were congressmen, Phil Burton, and he had a brother. And then later, one of them had a widow that became a congressman. And they were huge backers of Jim Jones, and Jones, was backers of them. Now, the reason why they're significant, they're deceased now, but they were the mentors. And Nancy Pelosi, she comes from a political family. But the mentors of her in San Francisco were these Burton brothers. And Pelosi at the time was, I think she was the chairman of the northern branch of the California Democratic Party or something like that. And although there's not like a whole lot of specific information linking Pelosi to Jones, she was part of that whole cabal that was propping up Jones. And certainly the people who were her mentors, the Burton brothers, were big Jones backers as well. I mean, you can go into, there's also celebrities, people like Jane Fonda. I have a letter from Jane Fonda to Jim Jones saying, I want to become a full and active participant in People's Temple. Now, what does that mean to you? To me, that means she was joining People's Temple.
Yeah.
And she said she wanted to do this for the sake of her kids. And which is ironic, thinking about all the hundreds of kids who died in People's Temple. And she had attended temple services. Jones regarded her as a member. I don't think he was wrong. When you read that letter and someone says, I want to be a full and active participant in your church, to me, that means you're a member. You're wanting to join the church. And the interesting thing about Fonda, people ask her all sorts of indelicate questions, like, Megyn Kelly got in trouble for asking her about her facelift. People ask her about that time that she went on that anti-aircraft gun in North Vietnam. Nobody ever asks her, hey, what about that time that you joined People's Temple? Could you tell us about that? That's kind of strange. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of inconvenient truths with regard to Jim Jones and all of the people who came within his orbit. Some came in, in a small way, and some in a rather large way, like Jane Fonda or Willie Brown or Harvey Milk. And yet there was no answering for any of that. And that's one of the reasons I wrote that book. I wrote Cult City, which, by the way, I have right here.
There you go.
There's the book.
I have your other book right here.
Oh,
Intellectual Morons. There you go. Old copy. All right. So do you think Jim Jones was always corrupt, or do you think as he gained more power, he became more and more corrupt?
Well, he in a sort of autobiographical sketch, he said into a recorder, talking about his life, he was thinking back and he thought to himself, how can I demonstrate my Marxism? And the thought occurred to him, infiltrate the church. And he's reflecting upon what he was thinking in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And, Jim Jones isn't always the best authority on Jim Jones. He's a liar. But I think in that one instance, he's probably telling the truth. In other words, he had a church that had sort of the trappings of of Pentecostal Christianity, where there's a lot of faith healings and he's curing people of sicknesses and all that kind of thing. He took that and he meshed it with Marxism, and he made this sort of social justice church. It didn't quite work out in Indianapolis, so he decided to go to California, and he went to California at an opportune time in the 60s, where a lot of people were really open to that kind of thing, wanted to hear that kind of socialist message, but we're also open to different kind of spirituality, New Age religions and that kind of thing, and he got ahead of the curve on that, and he went to the right place for that. But what also happened along the way is Jones, he starts wearing some interesting eye accoutrement, some sunglasses. And we know what kind of people wear sunglasses all 24/7, right? People that don't want you to see their eyes. Right. And usually these people are on drugs. And Jim Jones starts getting a rather massive narcotics habit. So, part of it, he was drunk on the politics, certainly. But the other part of it, he was a deeply, deeply evil man, troubled man, but he was also on drugs. And I think after his mom died, he was very close with his mother, things really came off the rails. And he was thinking that this place in South America was going to be a demonstration community to the world about how communism works. And everywhere he looked around him, it was a complete failure. People were starving. And so what he decided to do was he said that they were going to have what was called revolutionary suicide. And this came from a title of a book that Huey Newton wrote. It was called Revolutionary Suicide. And now the concept was pretty idiotic to begin with, but Jones twisted it a little bit, where Huey Newton said, well, revolutionary suicide is when someone can't stand the conditions of the world, so they sacrifice their life to make them better. Whereas reactionary suicide would be, I'm so beleaguered by the conditions of the world, I'm going to kill myself because I'm really depressed and this is horrible. So it's not exactly what Jones did, but if you listen to the death tape, he says, we didn't commit suicide, we committed an act of revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. He actually thought that people were going to look at that and say, wow, these people essentially went on strike against the world. They killed themselves because our world is so awful, but there's a better way, socialism, and everyone would sort of reject capitalism and embrace socialism because of this radical act that they all did. Instead, everyone just thought they were crazy and thought they were lunatics. And in fact, at the time, most people thought they were religious fanatics. They didn't realize that this was an atheistic group. Jones stomped on the Bible. And in fact, I talked to a couple people that were in Jonestown who were able to escape from there. One of them escaped literally with 3 bullet wounds in him. And the other one was in Georgetown at the time of the killings and witnessed some killings in Georgetown, the capital. But they both said that Jones forbade Bibles, that he banned Bibles, and that when they had Bibles shipped in there, he gave the Bibles out and instructed the people to use them as toilet paper. And because they had no toilet paper, that's what they did with it. So it's sort of odd that a guy like that, who had this contemptuous view of God, would be thought of as a religious fanatic. But really, by the time they get to Jonestown, there's not even a pretense about believing in God anymore. They are atheistic communists. And you can imagine people that were brought up in the church that stuck with him through that, they would probably stick with him through anything. And a lot of them did, obviously, to their own demise.
This reminds me of this new development that we see in modern society. My friend Dan van der Wolf, he wrote a book about how it's called Was Jesus a Liberal or a Conservative? But basically, one of the stories in the book is that he went. Well, this is a personal story, but basically that he went to this place and he wanted to have a prayer group, basically. And the lady asked him, this is a Christian church, and the lady asked him, do you believe in gay marriage? What does that have to do with it? You're going to rent a room. You're not, And she asked him a straight political question because she was wanting a yes. If she said no, they would decline him. And he said he didn't want to have any opinion on what there's groups like 12-step groups that have no opinion on outside issues, stuff like that. So it seems like this kind of where politics is first and religion is second is a phenomenon that's more and more common in today's age, where liberalism, the far left, or the wokeness is sort of eroding religion. And I can get on a rant about the current pope because I think he's getting, I don't know, what do you think about, because
Well, on that stuff, I don't think a whole lot about it. I feel like I'm not qualified.
Okay.
And that's why I said earlier, I'm the guy that sits in the back pew, and don't put me up near the podium when it comes to matters of religion. I just know what's in my heart and what's in my soul. And I'm really moved by, I have a shirt. I have a shirt that says, "Do unto others as you want others to do unto you." And I wear that shirt sometimes because, for me, that's a pretty compelling message, and Jesus's message is very compelling. But I'm not a theologian, and I'm pretty ignorant of these matters. And I guess the one thing I would say is that, like, I do think it's good you want to have as many people in the church, and hopefully people get the message. And there's people that believe in all sorts of things. That's okay. But at the end of the day, what you're talking about, this person actually was going to disqualify someone based on the fact that they had a belief that they probably felt was based on scripture, and yet they weren't going to be allowed in the church because they didn't believe in that. That's pretty wild. And Jones was ahead of the game on these things. With Jim Jones, the interesting thing was most of the people that came to his services came for the faith healing. They thought that he could heal them of cancer. And I even spoke to a guy who defected from People's Temple all these years later. I said, "When did you realize this was all a bunch of, that he was a charlatan?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "When did you realize this was a bunch of abracadabra?" He said, "What do you mean?" And I said, that he was doing magic tricks. He was a phony. This was not. He goes, "Oh no, Jim Jones had power." All these years later, this guy who despises Jim Jones believes he had extrasensory perception. He believed that, taught from reading minds, that he could cure people of various ailments, not just psychological ailments, but cancer and things like that, that he could tell the future. And so people came to Jim Jones so he could heal them of their ailments, and they sat through the political message. So if he gave a 3-hour speech on socialism, most of those people were not there to hear the socialism. They would absorb it. They were there to get healed. And they were there because they thought this guy was either God or he had some connection to God. And that was his big pull. His pull on maybe 10% of his followers was that he was, politically correct, that he was a Marxist. But most of the people were not there for Marxism. They may have came around to it, but that's not why they came in the first place.
They were naive and they were had, basically. All right.
Well, the opiate of the, Marx said religion's the opiate of the masses. What Jones did is he took the opiate of the masses and used that to turn them on to Marx. So there's something ingenious about that.
Oh, it's something sick about that as well. All right.
That's right.
So do you see any positive developments? Let us end on a positive note. What do you see the positive developments in the world today?
Well, I think that people are fed up with cancel culture, wokeness. One of the great things about Trump is he said the emperor has no clothes on all that stuff, that he would give his bombastic opinions, and it allowed people that were not as powerful as Trump to feel comfortable saying what was really on their mind. And in fact, his election was really a reaction in a lot of ways to elites telling Americans how they should vote. And in the same way that Brexit was that way in England and in Great Britain, rather. So I think there's a lot of people that are fed up with that. It may not be apparent, but I don't know how long that's going to last. I mean, because you can't live in a free country if you're not allowed to speak. So I view that as something positive. People can look at the big tech companies censoring conservatives and censoring people with heterodox ideas as a really awful thing, and it is. But I remember back in the days where there was just CBS, ABC, and NBC, and there was no such thing as Fox News. But people figured it out, and and right now, Fox News, last year, Fox News had more viewers than any other cable network in the United States. Not news network, cable network. It was the #1 cable network. So people will figure things out. And on the tech stuff, it's a little bit more daunting, because the idea that you're going to have a competitor to Amazon and Twitter and Facebook, that might be a little bit far-fetched. But people will figure it out. And I am optimistic about that. I'm not going to be the one figuring it out, but I think it'll happen.
It's coming. I saw there was a Thomas Sowell documentary that came out like a few weeks ago, and it already has 3 million views on YouTube. Think
about your own podcast. There's a lot of people like you that are able to broadcast things and to have people around the world, to read it or to view it or to hear it. That didn't exist a while back. And so I think a lot of the elites are very uncomfortable. If you think of all the people that have sort of came out of nowhere that have a big pull on the internet, I'm not saying Joe Rogan came out of nowhere, but like, Ben Shapiro or, the various podcasters that do well, or the various people that have their own networks and have their own websites and things like that. All of a sudden, someone can be a media mogul without going through the traditional route of CBS, ABC, New York Times, PBS, whatever. And there's something very heartening about that. I mean, sometimes it's scary to people because they're not always professional journalists or whatever. But as we know, like, the professional journalists aren't very professional either. So that's a positive thing.
A lot of them are hacks nowadays.
That's right.
So where can people find you? You used to run a blog.
Not so much anymore. Hopefully I'll get that back up and running. I write primarily, I'm a senior editor with the American Spectator, and they can find me at spectator.org. I write a newsletter every weekday called Spectator AM. And if you want to, I have a whole bunch of books. This is the most recent one, Cult City, Jim Jones, Harvey Milk, and 10 Days That Shook San Francisco. But I also, written stuff that has nothing to do with politics. Is The War on Football. This blue collar intellectual books is not very political. This is a big, thick book I wrote called Conservative History of the American Left. And people seem to really like that one. And Intellectual Morons is another one that people like. And I've written a lot of other stuff, but that's kind of where I'm at. But spectator.org if you want to find me, or go to a library or Amazon or wherever you buy books if you want to read one of my books.
All right. Well, Daniel Flynn, it was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you everybody for listening and watching.